Dear friends, we're happy to welcome you to the Ukrainian Media Center at the Ukraine Forum News Agency. We will continue talking about the sad anniversary of the beginning of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. In spite of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia has not lost its imperial essence, and starting from the moment when the Soviet Union broke up, they started to prepare for the time when they were aiming at restoring their domination, at least in the post-Soviet space. So the aggression that started on the 20th of February 2014 was not there by chance. It was not the reaction to the events in Ukraine. It was the planned action. Russia was waiting for the convenient moment and using the internal infighting in Ukraine, using the efforts that Ukrainians have spent to overthrow the undemocratic regime of Yanukovych, they started the war. And it's very important for us to remember that the war has not started in February 2022, but in February 2014. As the resident of the city of Donetsk at that time, I felt this myself, as well as millions of Ukrainians for whom the war has started 10 years ago. So today we are gathered here in order to have a look at the sufferings of Ukrainians over these 10 years of Russian aggression, to look at the injustice that is there for Ukrainians because of the Russian aggression. Our panel discussion is called East, the path to justice. It is logically linked to the panels that we had here previously. We started with the Maidan. This was Ukrainians' fight for injustice, and the Ukrainians have risen in the winter of 2013-14 to overcome the injustice that was brought to them by the regime of Yanukovych. Then we talked about Crimea, and now we will talk about East, because in fact from March 2014 Russia was staging provocation in the East, but in April the infiltration of armed gangs started there. We have a very interesting panel today, in store because we will have a chance to build the logic of our conversation from specific to general. We'll try to look at the certain personal experience of people who have regrettably lived through dramatic events in their lives. They were incarcerated or were prisoners of war on the Russian-occupied territory, and we'll talk on from the point of view of civilians and also from POWs, and then we will rise to the new level of abstraction, where we will try to understand how these events were developing and how they were conditions through the system of justice, because both Ukrainian and international courts face the problem, the issue, how to reply, how to react to these complicated questions. So the participants are Executive Director of the Medium Initiative for Human Rights, Tetiana Katrychenko. Also, we have here Alina Pavliuk, who is a lawyer from the Ukrainian Legal Advisors Group, Olena Lazareva, who is the anesthetic doctor and who on the 16th of October 2017 was detained by illegal armed formations in the separate regions, districts of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts before the February of 2022. We also have here Alexei Kodman, who is the veteran of Russian-Ukrainian war and a former POW. He used to be the intelligence fighter of the 56th Mechanized Infantry Brigade. He was sentenced by those quasi-courts at the occupied territory. Andrei Leshchenko, who is the deputy head of the Department for Processual and Accusation Department of the Department to counteract the crimes in conditions of armed conflict. We also have the judge from the Supreme Court of Ukraine, Mykola Mazur, and I'm journalist and moderator Serhiy Stukanov. So, friends, let's not encroach on your time or on the time of our speakers, and I invite Tetiana Katrychenko from the Media Initiative for Human Rights. Let's try to look at the territories that were occupied in the east from the spring of 2014. We know that torture chambers were set up there by Russians and their stooges, and you could be thrown to a cellar, which is a coined phrase, not even when you did something wrong, but when you were just not liked by a representative of the occupation authorities, and thousands of Ukrainians went through this on the occupied territories. So what's your take on this? Hello everyone, thank you for coming here and for your attention to this very important topic. Our panel is called 10 Years of Russian Aggression, the Ukrainian Path to Justice. It's very hard to tell about 10 years of what was happening to us within 5 minutes, but I'll try to outline the limits of our vision. Of course, when we're talking about 2014, we are still living in 2024, because now we have an impression that we have already gone through all this, and it's a repetition of what's been there. However, we probably have not done enough to avoid what is happening now. we all remember how the Russian Federation and the world and Ukraine as well, let's be honest, were in doubt who was organizing such systemic separatist moods and feelings and then attacks from the Russian Federation, even when we were quite sure that the Russian military were on the territory of Ukraine in July and August of 2014. The world was still in doubt in principle about what was happening in Ukraine, and Russia at that moment was both brave enough and not brave enough. When they saw that there's no reaction, adequate reaction to what they were doing, was not there, they started to increase the intensity of their actions, and we can talk about how this happened, about this on the example of detention of civilians on the occupied territories and about on the example of taking Ukrainian military as prisoners. Alexei Kodman is here, who was the prisoner of war then, but the security service of Ukraine did not call them prisoners of war. They were calling them hostages because there was anti-terrorist operation, not war there. We were confused about definitions as well. But the Russians were taking our military as POWs in their hundreds of thousands, and of course there was no talk even about observing Geneva Conventions. Very many of them were tortured, they were beaten, and then they were given back to Ukraine within the framework of the so-called exchanges. I remember there were a number of such exchanges in 2014 and in early 2015. But then the Russian Federation understood that Ukraine is treating both civilians and military in the same way, and because previously they were detaining civilians for several days or several weeks, and we still don't know about many of them. I'm a member of the Special Commission at the Ministry of Reintegration, where I still see statements from Ukrainian citizens written in 2024, but they were actually detained in 2014. And those were doctors and teachers and judges, but some of them are silent about this even now. In 2016, I guess, Russia started to level their attitude towards civilians and the military. They started to give us back both civilians and military within the framework of exchanges, and the last exchange took place in 2020. And the Russians were upkeeping a special system for keeping these people in custody on the occupied territory. First, yes, there were cellars, like in the building of the Security Service Ukraine in Donetsk. Then there were investigation cells, and then prisons on the territory of the Russian Federation. And they have actually established a quasi-legal system on the occupied territories, from detention to keeping them in custody. All those places are illegal, and then to the investigation prison, and then to special women's colonies, and they also established courts, and the first courts in Luhansk and Donetsk, the so-called Supreme Courts, started to function, who looked into these cases, politically motivated, on the occupied territories, they started to look into not only civilians' cases, but also into military cases, and some former prisoners of war were coming back with the so-called accusation acts among them. So this machine was just going and rotating, and many survivors, many victims, and many of those who suffered were hoping for the way to justice, that sooner or later every crime that was perpetrated on the occupied territories would be punished. Regrettably, we, as the Media Initiative for Human Rights, we were talking to many witnesses and to many released civilians and military. They were talking that they were hoping that justice will arrive, but for quite some time we have to state that this hasn't happened yet. And then there was the full-scale invasion and the new wave of aggression. So these 8 years of occupation are forgotten by many of us. Even when we are talking about hostages, about civilians and some military who are still POWs on the occupied territory of Donetsk region, for instance, there's a special list of those people who were detained before the 24th of February 2022. So if there are questions, I'm ready to answer, but thank you for your attention. And our topic is huge, and there's a lot to talk about. You have said very rightly that we have to remember about the 8 years that elapsed before the full-scale invasion, and we should remember about the hereditary link about these two periods, and they are logically proceeding from one from another. But I see there's a paradox as well. If we are talking about political aspect, we were talking more about Donetsk and Luhansk within the Minsk or Normandy formats, and we were talking less about Crimea until the Crimean platform has arisen. And if we are talking about the protection of human rights on the occupied territory, in this respect, we were talking more about Crimea, not about the east of the country. It is important that our optics is now focused equally on both the so-called old and new occupied territories. Now I invite to speak Alina Lazareva. She is a doctor. We said here already, because the occupants were not choosing whom they were, not selecting whom they were detaining. Everyone could be in the cellar, thrown to the cellar. You didn't even have to have a pro-Ukrainian position stance. So what's your experience of being a hostage of the occupying forces in the East? And maybe you will try to tell us more broadly about the women hostages situation there. I'm very honored to be here among you to talk about this very important topic. I am a resident of Donetsk, and in 2014, when all this started, we did not go anywhere from Donetsk, because at first you thought that it was like you felt it was a theater of absurd. And no one in their sober mind were thinking that this could go for such a long time. Everyone was expecting that because this was so laughable, this could not last for long, and that this should have ended very soon, and the normal order would be restored and Ukraine will work in a normal way. Regrettably, this did not happen. All this was gaining in scope, and we were seeing all this. However, we still remained there. We were waiting first when this will end. Then, because of some reasons, we lingered behind. We stayed behind. I continued to work at a hospital. And yes, I knew that for all this time, people were going missing in Donetsk. Some people were looked for at hospitals. We were asked, have we seen them or not? Have we treated patients with these and these surnames, with such personal data? But no one knew where those people were. Then there was a talk about torture chambers where people were brought right from the street and where you could find yourself just for nothing. As you said, both for pro-Ukrainian stance and those because you were cooperating with Ukrainian military and for your posts in social networks, but just also because your neighbors complained about you. The reason would not be a valid reason, even when the exchanges started. And there were quite frequent exchanges at the start. We were thinking that they were collecting the so-called exchange stock. They were snatching people from the streets in order to exchange them for whom they wanted. I and my husband were captured in October 2017. We were accused of espionage, and this was the warden was the espionage for the favor of the foreign state of Ukraine. I would say that we were living in Ukraine at that time, and although this was called the special districts of Luhansk and Donetsk region, this still was the state of Ukraine. So I was there from 17th of October 2017, and I and my husband were released within the framework of the last huge exchange of civilians in December 2019. We changed the several places of detention, starting from the torture center called Isolation, where they used Izolatia or isolation art platform, which used to be an industrial plant. I was there for 10 months, and there were other women with me. Some of those women whom I got to know even there in isolation, they are still there from 2017. Not specifically in the isolation, but in detention centers from 2017. And this is just horrible. They treat women so cruelly, in such a cruel way. Physical torture, sexual torture, psychological and moral pressure. They are treating everyone in this way, but there is special emphasis in this relation as far as women are concerned. They want to torture women even more. And later, when you are in this isolation, you know, there's a special department of the so-called State Security Ministry of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. This is real isolation. You don't have any access to any information, no access to any outer space. You don't have a watch or a clock. You don't even know what time it was. You were just surviving there. You know, when you are there for 1, 2, or 3 days, you were just thinking, well, maybe there were some hopes that you were taken by mistake and you will be released soon. But then later, when it grew and grew and grew, you understood that this was not by chance and you just have to survive. And you know, this is just one Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day, once and again, once again. And the only difference was when you were taken for interrogation, either within the isolation or outside. And this was, in a way, different from this routine existence that there was. Just another question. Do you know why you were detained? Was this the complaint by your neighbors? And another, were you able to communicate with your husband? I still don't know why we were detained. Well, someone could have their hand in this, but we don't know. And you know, when we were released, there was no opportunity to investigate this. We were isolated from one another. I know that my husband was in the isolation as well, but he was in a male cell and I was in a female women's cell. We haven't seen each other, we haven't talked to each other. And for over 2.5 years that we were in custody, we saw each other only once during the so-called court hearing. And then we came to the exchange place. Then we met each other. Before that, we just heard that we were both there, but we haven't seen each other. And I would like to add also that these pro-Russian stooges, mercenaries who were guarding us there, I think that they were pleased by the fact, you know, they were telling me, you know, your husband, some interesting things were done with him, and you could only guess what was done to him. At the same, they could tell my husband about myself. The prisoners were also forced to work. You couldn't do anything to reject this. And of course, it started with some everyday things like wash the floor or cook the meal, but the men were also made to unload military cargo, and there was a huge industrial zone on the territory of the plant, and there was a military unit there. So Russian military were using prisoners to load and unload some military equipment. And also the things that they have stolen from civilians. It's very bad that you had such an experience, and I regret that you have to go back to your personal sufferings, but it is very important to tell the people about this. We also have a book which tells us about the isolation. Paradox, it was, by the way, situated at the street which is called, if translated into English, the Bright Path. It is available in English, and people who know English can immerse themselves into this atmosphere and understand that the torture chambers organized by the Russians in the east of Ukraine in 2014 are really comparable to Nazi torture chambers. And you know, this is happening in fact, in the center of Europe, and Europe was hoping that they have left this behind after 1945. But we also have a experience of a military veteran who was taken prisoner of war in the east by the Russians. So I will give the floor to Alexei. However, I would like to remind you that after we exchange our opinions, we will open the floor for questions, both from the audience here and for those who watch us online. So, Alexei Kodman, the veteran of the Russian-Ukrainian war, would you please share your experience, how you were taken hostage, as this was called then, but in fact this was captivity, and what is your take on what was happening there? Well, I would like to stress that I was not a hostage. I was taken a prisoner of war on the battlefield, and I say that this is not just 10 years of Russian aggression, it's 10 years of war. In 2015, in November, I was taken prisoner of war in the Mariupol sector, next to the village of Pavliuk. This was during a combat action. A group of enemy intelligence fighters took us prisoners, and there were their commander was from Russia. There were some other Russians, but the rest were locals. First, they applied physical pressure to us. They have put blindfolds on us. They also tied our hands. They took away some things. I think those were people from Regiment Number 9, or the so-called 10, the Army of the Donetsk People's Republic. We were interrogated on site. Then we were taken to Donetsk, to the former State Security of Ukraine building. And there were interrogations. I was put in a solitary confinement, no light, no washing. Just once a day I was taken to the toilet. Then, I don't remember the exact day, but there was a representative of the Ministry of State Security of the Donetsk People's Republic, so-called. So I and another guy were taken to the central square of Donetsk, to the monument to Vladimir Lenin, where they shot propaganda videos, where we were made to say that there were no Russians at war, that those who wage war against Ukraine are for Ukraine, but not for the so-called fascist regime. Then we were brought back to imprisonment, and we were taken to some dirty work that no one else wanted to do. Sometimes people from the counterintelligence service would come and they would apply physical and psychological pressure against us. And you know, I'm emphasizing that this was the war with Russia. When I was in imprisonment, I know that the privates were there, and there were Russians among the privates as well. But as far as senior commanders are concerned, they were Russians. Yes, the field commander could be from Luhansk or Donetsk or Crimea, but the senior commander would be a Russian. Absolutely. They would change their call signs, but they still were Russians. And this was everywhere. Russia, even then, was taking part in the war, and everyone knows about this, and everyone would talk about this then, but no one wanted to admit this on the official level. They were just talking that Russia is providing money or delivering weapons. After we were taken away from the former state security building, we were taken to the next to the DMZ plant. We were there for some time, and then again in the city of Donetsk, we were taken to the Molodizhna, the youth street. And there was the headquarters of some Ukrainian party, probably Batkivshina Motherland. Then in the summer 2016, we were transferred to colony number 37. We were there in the so-called roofed prison, and there were people who were serving life sentences there, or those who have committed horrible crimes like killing, murder, or something like this. We were there without any rights, and no one knew where we were, and neither international organizations or Red Cross or OSCE were allowed to see us. I guess that it was only closer to the autumn that people from the UN were allowed to see us. So I was there until December 2017, but in summer 2017, the so-called representatives of the General Procurator's Office of the Donetsk People's Republic came to us, and they accused us, and there were 36 of us, both civilians and military. They accused us of terrorism, which meant 22 years of prison. However, I did not go to court before the exchange, and I know that after I was exchanged, those people who got life sentences, they were serving their term in the city of Makiyivka. I would like to stress the fact that Russians were there from 2014, and I think that Maidan has also happened with Russia's participation, and this is the war against Ukraine, but there are some colder and some hotter phases. Thank you, Alexei. If there would be questions, we will be able to dwell upon these messages, but when we were able to, as we have been able to feel deeper the situation that thousands of Ukrainians faced, both civilians and military, and still are facing this situation, it is worth going to the level of qualification and defining how was this defined by the Ukrainian legal system and the international legal system, and what are the difficulties when the courts and prosecutors' offices are defining these events. Russia was acting in a hybrid way. They tried to show that this was presumably the uprising of local people against the so-called Kiev junta, and this was all masked by the so-called republics, which were self-proclaimed. But in the international community, apparently scared of calling the spade, things with their names, and afraid of throwing a gauntlet to Russia. They did not call war the war. So I now give the floor to Andriy Leshchenko, who represents the Office of General Prosecutor. How in Ukraine we tried to qualify the crimes that were done by the occupying forces there, and what was the dynamics there from 2014 until now. Hello everyone, thank you for giving me the opportunity to take part in this event. We understand now that 10 years that have elapsed are the years of our active resistance and fighting against the aggression. I think that it is necessary to know that in the direction that we have outlined, the crime of aggression, I started to work on this direction from 2015. By that time, the management, the seniors at the General Prosecutor's Office understood that proof and evidence should be collected. And of course, this was not only for the internal consumption, but also for the international attention. We understood that in Ukraine there was an attack of another country on one country, and although this was a hybrid way of attacking us, it still was aggression. So there was a special department set up at the General Prosecutor's Office, and we started to document those crimes. The focus of attention was on two aspects. First, to prove that this was the crime of aggression, not the civil war, as Russia tried to say, but that this was the act of aggression of one nation against other nation. We were able to collect some evidence about this, and you may remember that there were interceptions of telephone conversations between Glaziev, Zatulin, and the people whom they talked to, and we all got to know that the events in Crimea, in the east of Ukraine, in Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Luhansk, and Donetsk Oblast were directed by the actors from the Russian Federation. They were directly organized. Those presumably massive disturbances by people who were not in agreement with the results of the Revolution of Dignity were staged, and they also tried to proclaim their so-called independence. And in some of those conversations, there were direct quotes, let's act in the Eastern Ukrainian scenario, let's convene local self-government and say that we do not recognize the Kiev authority. And in Russia at that time, there was a new doctrine about the new way of conducting war. It is not open. The hot stage of armed actions is being protracted for as long as possible, delayed as long as possible. The so-called hybrid doctrine of Gerasimov, which was presented at the Military Sciences Academy in 2013, then in 2017 they have introduced it once more, so we can see from the fragments of information in mass media, including the Russian ones, that this idea was in that the wars now are not declared. They use the so-called protest potential of local population. Everything is done to create hotbeds of political dissatisfaction on the territory of the enemy, adversary, and then use in their own purposes. Russia was aiming at just one thing, to remain, as they called it, a great power. They wanted to keep Ukraine within the zone of its influence. They could not allow our Euro integration hopes to be realized, because this would be the geopolitical loss of Russia in the global dimension. Another aim is the huge propaganda influence on the population of another country, and if we analyze this, we see that starting from the end of late 2013, the mass media of Russia starts to equal Ukrainians to Nazis and fascists. For Russians and also for our citizens, this is the biggest trauma that's been on the territory of our country before 2014, the Second World War. And of course, they started to artificially increase the number of such comparisons, including the state television channels of Russia and the information space at large. This meant that this was a concerted action in order to increase the protest feelings among Ukrainians, and we remember that all those disturbances in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine were under the slogan that we do not recognize the fascist regime and we should fight the Kiev junta. Also, the hybrid doctrine includes the covert use of military units. In Crimean case, we see that the blockage of Ukrainian military units was done by military units which were not identified as Russian units. Only after the annexation of Crimea happened, Putin recognized that he planned and executed this plan. And I think that in 2014, most of us were not prepared to see the international military armed conflict on the territory of Ukraine. Of course, all this requires long planning, long realization. However, as for now, we have enough proof to say that it was from 2006 that Russia was preparing the invasion of Ukraine, and in 2008, when they invaded Georgia, the Russian military chief says that this was prepared, the invasion of Georgia was prepared since 2006, when Georgia said that they wanted to become members of European Union and NATO, and it is logical to presume that the same was done in relation to Ukraine. Coming back to collecting the evidence, we faced quite a challenge, because this was a new direction in the work of our investigators and prosecutors, because previously we did not deal with international law. However, since we started to investigate these conflicts, we thought that this was war or the armed conflict of international nature, and we were applying the definition of the crime of aggression to this. There was a number, we used Article number 37, applied it to several defendants, however, not to the high-level officials of the Russian Federation, because we thought that they should be given to international justice. However, we were continuing to collect testimony and evidence, and I would like to thank very much the public organizations, NGOs that were accompanying our activity, because we were moving in parallel, and very soon we understood that the mass of information is too significant for us to even collect it. So we asked NGOs for help, and some of them have, on their own initiative, addressed us so that they could help us. And after we have established more stable contacts, the process accelerated. We started to collect evidence that was about the violation of the rules and customs of war. And of course, the crime of aggression opens the door to all other kinds of crimes, because there are war crimes pertaining to the violation of customs and laws of war. And first of all, these are the crimes perpetrated in relation to Ukrainian prisoners of war. And until 2019, we were able to get testimony from almost 2,000 people who were in detention in Luhansk and Donetsk region. Some of them were also detained on the territory of the Russian Federation, and this information enabled us to show to the world community the systematic and large-scale crimes perpetrated on the territory of Ukraine, and we also were able to show that these are not separate crimes, and they are the product of the activity of people who started this war and of those people who led occupation administrations on these territories. We found more and more evidence of participation and crimes of Russian Federation. First of all, the crime of aggression. We also did the interception of telephone conversation, which proved that Russian generals are in factual command of the so-called First and Second Army Corps, that they provide military equipment to those illegal armed formations. They are planning, they are commanding them, and they use the results of these military operations. And those were active Russian generals in the sense that they were members of the armed forces of Russia, but were sent on missions to the occupied territories in order to command units there. We have also seen that during the Ilovaisk cauldron, when the Russians have invaded Ukraine and surrounded the garrison in Ilovaisk, and then they broke any trust and attacked our military and killed and wounded many of them. This all was done by Russian military under the command of Russian generals. It's no secret that there were negotiations between general staffs of Ukraine and Russia in order to make to release those people from surrounding, from encirclement, but we are running short of time. Okay, to sum up, I want to tell you that it is hard to collect such evidence because we do not have access to territory, we do not have an opportunity to conduct forensics there and other investigation. But whatever opportunity there was, we were using to the biggest extent. And yes, we can prove that this was the crime of aggression, and all the evidence was given to international justice system, and the decision, the ruling about the international armed conflict nature of these events was adopted by the International Criminal Court back in 2017, and this gave the understanding to the international community that the war is between Russia and Ukraine, and this is not an internal armed conflict. Dear friends, we understand that the way to justice mentioned in the title of our discussion has to end in court, and it is courts that should pass sentences, and those criminals on the occupied territories deserve punishment. And I may remind you that at the beginning of this year, the so-called Pavliuk Denis Kulikovsky, the commander of this isolation camp, was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment. We think that this is rather a just sentence, but the puzzling thing here is that for 2 years he was in Kiev, although he was publicly known as the person responsible for torture of many Ukrainian prisoners. So I want to give the floor to Alina Pavliuk. She's a lawyer of the Ukrainian Legal Advisory Group. Let's talk about the experience at the international level, both the European Court of Human Rights and the International Criminal Court, who had to deal with the influx of cases from Ukraine. But let's also try to keep to 7 or 8 minutes in our speeches. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share the experience. I'll try to be brief, and I'll try to produce some conclusions after those 10 years, after the 8 years of what was happening mostly in Donbass. First, as early as in 2014, it was rather noticeable that the situation in Donbass is rather different from what was happening in Crimea, and the nature of active combat showed us that there were new challenges that you have to meet, that there are new crimes that you have to document, because when we talk about the Crimean situation, we are talking about the occupation of the territory, but in this case, we are talking about combat and access and delineation. And then, of course, what was happening in the occupied territory, the establishment of a system there of what was happening to the civilians, and what Tetiana mentioned in the beginning, the East as well as Crimea, in essence, have become the territories that were used as the grounds, testing grounds for different crimes and violations that were happening there, forcible disappearance and forcible deportation of people. You know, they started to happen in 2014, before they started to happen in 2022. But the biggest question is still how to qualify, how to define what was happening in the East, in the Donbass, starting from 2014, because this is truly an example when the political processes and political decisions were influencing the vision of what was happening. First of all, we have our national level, and after the declaration of the anti-terrorist operation in April 2014, this influenced the legal definition very strongly because it was from 2014 that we had the qualification of those crimes as terrorist activity and terrorist violations, and the definition of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as terrorist organizations. But it was quite another level demonstrated by the International Criminal Court, who started to examine the evidence in their latest report. As far as the East is concerned, they arrived at a conclusion that there's a mixed nature armed conflict in the East, which means that both international and non-international armed conflict or signs of this are there. And when the court was able to find the proof of the responsibility of the Russian Federation, this happened in mid-July of 2014. The Russian. So this is the tentative period that was defined by the court, and now we see how the priority has of the investigating of events has shifted to after the February 2024. But this does not mean that we should ignore the 8 years that the situation was before 2022. And of course, only the court hearing can put a full stop here. Then there are several other cases, including Ukraine and the Netherlands against the Russian Federation. They are defining and studying the events since 2014. There's another dimension there, the autonomy or independence of the illegal armed formation and the preliminary conclusions of the International Court for Human Rights, European Court for Human Rights, say that from July 2014, Russia was in effective control of the situation in Donbass. However, there's still some time lag from April to July, when the gangs have seized Slovyansk. And then there's another ruling of the International Criminal Court of the UN, and it was about the Convention of the illegal financing of terrorist activity. And the Ukrainian position was about that this was terrorist organization, terrorist activity, and Russian Federation is responsible for this. But it is rather interesting to see the contents of this case, and it was surprising to see that it was the Russian Federation who said that there's armed conflict in the Donbass as far as this case is concerned. So far we have just one defining resolution, and this is the resolution of the International Criminal Court. And I think that it is important that in the future we see all those 10 years as one continuing conflict. As far as justice is concerned, next to Crimea, the events in Donbass became a challenge for law enforcers as far as how to collect the evidence is concerned, and we have formed a rather unique experience as investigators and prosecutors how to work in dangerous places under shelling and all this kind of stuff. of this, and it is very important that we do not lose this experience. The next thing is how our national legislation was able or was not able to adjust to the challenges of the armed conflict. I think that they have not yet managed to do this. There's quite a lot of issues about our criminal code and its adjustment to the international criminal law. And the main topic, which is urgent for Ukraine, if we are so happy about the work of the International Criminal Court, why don't we ratify the Statute of Rome? It looks like we don't have time for this, or we have different priorities when we have to solve this issue. So our home task after these 10 years, including what was happening and is happening in the East, we still have quite a lot of challenges. However, we see how there are new issues linked to the legal status of different kinds of persons appear in the legal field, who are the civilians who were in custody, how to protect the prisoners of war, how to be with the social guarantees to people on the occupied territories, how we protect the witnesses. Of course, these are the issues that naturally arise during legal processes, and at this I rest my case for the moment. Dear friends, really, we, during those 10 years, Ukrainian legal system was struggling to define legal terms, or probably borrowing something from foreign reality. And of course, this was quite a challenge for the Ukrainian judiciary. So I ask that the judge of the Supreme Court, Mykola Mazur, shares with us the Ukrainian experience of the judiciary, how this was done, and how they were able to define and qualify legal issues. And maybe you can provide us with a sentence about whether we at all can traverse this path to freedom, to justice. We have just talked about the role of international courts and institutions in restoring justice, and of course their role is very important, especially where bringing to responsibility of the leaders of the aggressor country is concerned, as they enjoy immunity according to the international law. But we also have to raise the level of these issues from the national to the international legal level, and it is desirable that sentencing those leaders should be done at the international level, not just by one party of the conflict. But of course, the bigger number of criminal cases and legal issues in relation to the conflict that's going on in Ukraine for 10 years is with the Ukrainian courts. Before I became a member of the Supreme Court, I was a judge in a small town, which probably you all know, this town of Popasna in Luhansk region. I was there a judge from 2012 to 2017. So I have my own life and judge's experience of those events. I remember the times when our small town saw those armed gangs, and we still continued to work, and we still continued to make resolutions in the name of Ukraine, although there was some fear that those armed people could come and do something bad to us. We were lucky that they did not visit us, but I do know cases in Luhansk or Donetsk region, those armed gangs were coming to judges and prevented them from working or demanded that they effect justice in the name of those illegal republics. I can thank our warriors that they have liberated the town of Popasna then, and of course I can also thank our warriors for the opportunity that we now can be here and discuss these issues. Regrettably, it was not possible then to liberate the entire territory of Luhansk, Donetsk regions of Crimea, and we were right on the delineation limit there, and we continued to work even when we had shelling and we heard explosions out of our windows, and also the small arms fire not far from the town in the fields. The events in 2014 have really changed the lives of many people, including judges and judiciary. Our judiciary were not prepared for such events, and our legislation did not contain answers to many challenges that arose. And I would like to say that the first challenge that we should discuss is that after the occupation, a certain part of courts on the occupied territory stopped their work, and the state had to provide for the access to justice of those people who were in the occupied territories. Such mechanisms were developed. The legislation was adopted that allowed to change the area of responsibility of the courts, and this was done as early as in August 2014. Also, there was legislation that allowed judges from the occupied territory to get transferred to the courts on the free territory as being on a mission. And of course, these mechanisms have been of great use to us in 2022. So during the first month since the full-scale invasion started, it was able to adopt decisions that provided for the continuation of the work of judiciary. And by the way, it helped to prevent the Russian Federation to open a new front at the European Court of Human Rights, because they were accusing Ukraine of not providing for pensions or for the court system work on the occupied territories. However, the European Court would not admit these complaints and cases to be considered. Then we should talk about two aspects of the judiciary's activity, and first of them is the prosecution of criminals connected to the activities of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. I looked at the court register today, and I found something like 4,500 sentences where the names DLR and PL and LNR are mentioned. The other part of cases was related to the protection of human rights, because crimes are crimes, but the life goes on, and people have a lot of questions and issues that could not be solved within the system of legislation which was not adjusted to the wartime. One of the examples is the issue of births and deaths on the temporarily occupied territory. This was this issue that was formed at the level of court system when the courts started to apply the so-called Namibian exceptions. And this was for the first done by the International Court when applied to the occupied Namibia. And the essence of the resolution was that the acts of occupying power should not be, as a rule, recognized as legal, except for the cases when this can undermine people's rights. And of course, we have not adopted this principle in the way it was, but we started to investigate the cases in this vein. And there were other cases as well, like people who lived in the free territory controlled by the government could not receive their pensions because the documents corroborating their work rate record were on the occupied territory, and the courts were looking into these cases as well. So we see that the courts were playing an exceptionally important part in providing for the human rights or social rights of those people. As far as criminal cases are concerned, the Ukrainian courts are the courts that should, first of all, look into these cases, because not a single international court is able to look into thousands and thousands of cases that were taking place both before and after the full-scale invasion in the east of Ukraine. I can remember a number of cases that were considered by Ukrainian courts, and first of all, it is the sentence to the former president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, whereby he was sentenced for high treason and his participation in planning and conducting the aggressive war of Russia against Ukraine. Also, other significant officials who abetted in this aggression were sentenced, and the Supreme Court approved of these decisions, and it was also about the so-called leader of the Luhansk People's Republic, who was a citizen of the Russian Federation and came to Ukraine in spring 2014 to do what he was supposed to do. But of course, we have lost a lot of cases which remained on the occupied territory, and we cannot consider these cases. They are outside of our control, of our will. Still, I think that Ukrainian courts can make their contribution to the establishment of justice. However, I'm sure that it will take many years or probably many decades to consider all the cases connected to this war. Thank you for your very important introduction to the court system. And now I'm addressing the audience. We have something like 15 minutes before we finish our panel. You have an opportunity to ask a brief question and address it to a specific speaker. Hello, I am Denis Rodunitsa. I'm a lawyer. I'm a coordinator of the coalition of NGOs Ukraine, the 5 a.m. My question to Judge Mykola: thank you for sharing the experience and achievements with us. But I have a question about what are the challenges or difficulties the court system faces now in the context of the Russian aggression, or which may arise very soon? How can you predict what the Ukrainian courts have to pay their special attention to, make some conclusions, taking into account the imperfection of the Ukrainian system? Your Honor, let's keep the answer to 2 or 2.5 minutes, okay? I can tell you in several messages, because I think that we will talk about this during the next panel. Yes, there are challenges. The challenges are, well, let's start from the fact that some of the courts were physically destroyed. Some of the courts are still working in horrible conditions on the front line, in essence, under constant shellings. The shellings and the attacks are, of course, happening in Kiev as well, but the level of danger and threat there is hard to compare to those courts that are on the front line. We have shortage of staff in the judiciary, and this, of course, complicates the timeline. But the major challenges in the legal field are connected to the in absentia procedure when the defendant is not there. On the one hand, of course, this provides us with an opportunity to consider thousands and thousands of crimes, war crimes, that Russians are committing on the territory of Ukraine, because you should not allow a snowball to form that we won't be able to disentangle later, and the society demands that we consider them now. But on the other hand, there's a danger that if we do not treat this properly, if we lower the standard of proof, this can, by the way, provoke later claims against us in the European Court of Human Rights. And do not forget that Russians can start cases against one. I would not like to see the cases which Russia has won in several decades. I want to tell you that we are working very hard on this. The judges are training regularly, and if you look at the level of proof and argumentation, and over the last 2 years, we see the trend for an essential increase of the level. Again, other questions? I'm Tetiana Katrychenko. I have a question to Andriy Leshchenko. You have mentioned that the Procurator's office has testimony of 2,000 people who are victims and were detained in custody by the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. But how many criminal cases are registered where the events are concerned from 2014 to 2022? We now have 122,000 cases after the 24th of February 2022, but before this, and also how many of them are qualified as high treason or the terrorism acts, and how many of them are already in courts? Look, I cannot answer all the questions here, but I'll try. The system was built in the way so that we avoid the secondary traumatization of victims during interrogations. So all these interrogations were happening within the framework of one criminal case, and then it was sent to the court according to the criminal processual code. So I say that this is not indicative about how many people cases we launched before the 2022. The figure of 122,000 that you see on the site of the Prosecutor General's office is about war crimes. And it's not only about bad treatment of civilian hostages or prisoners of war. This is also shelling of civilian objects, also summary attacks like in Kramatorsk. But we are talking here only about war crimes, not about treason. And it was not my responsibility before, because we were working only with the crime of aggression and war crimes.
I do a lot of different jobs in Ukraine, and one of them is as an investigator. I investigate war crimes committed not just by the enemy, but I also investigate war crimes committed by commanders. I investigate crimes committed by individual soldiers, by the Office of the Prosecutor General, and Alexei, your own department I investigate. The Rome Accords we haven't yet ratified in Ukraine. When do you believe that we will have the Accords ratified so the ICC and people like myself can do the work that we need to do?
На жаль, дійсно, Римський статут, він не ратифікований в Україні, однак це не позбавляє нас можливості.
Yes, the Statute of Rome has not been ratified in Ukraine, but this does not actually prevent us from working with the International Criminal Court, because other acts empower us to exchange information with the international courts. There is such a procedure. We get claims and letters, and we pass on the information of people in the International Criminal Court, and we hope that this is being taken into account when they issue orders for the arrests.
When do you believe that the Rome Accords will be ratified so people like myself who investigate war crimes can utilize that in the ICC?
І щодо цього питання, кожен має можливість подати такі докази до Офісу.
Well, everyone can provide this evidence to the ICC. I am a representative of a legal enforcement body. However, you should ask our politicians about this. And the tools of investigating prosecutor is, of course, limited. We try to use it to the full extent. We try to use it in a most efficient way, and then we pass it on, this evidence and proof, to other bodies. Yes, for us this was a simplified procedure, which of course has its own advantages. And I think that we have enough time for just one question from the floor. Anyone? Very briefly, but very globally, we're talking about Ukrainian centrism, but what we can suggest to the international practice of investigating such crimes, because the conflicts are growing globally, and this is to the legal advisor and the prosecutor. From my own experience, I'll tell you that as of now, we have traversed a long way from understanding from being aware that we are at war because we've been attacked, to the current situation when we can provide and share this information with other institutions, as we are now in a unique situation when we are being addressed for assistance and sharing the experience, because there were conferences and meetings with partners from other countries, including Great Britain. Not a single representative from these countries has said that their systems were adjusted and adapted to investigating this mass of crimes. They are taking into account the experience that we have amassed during these 10 years of war, and they are modernizing some of their systems and some of their units, and they are also adjusting the number of personnel in case something similar happens in their countries. So as Taras Shevchenko has said, we are learning the experience of other people, and we are aware of our own experience. So I think that we are using now something like 80% of the available sources of information, and we are going our own way now. And it is true that there are such precedents. We're being addressed as far as the relevant experience is concerned, including Israel as well. As far as the judiciary is concerned, we have started, or I have started, with the role of international courts, but of course, the role of national courts in prosecuting military war criminals is increasing now, including Europe, and including the establishment of universal jurisdiction as far as war criminals and crimes are concerned. So there are international actions and events with the exchange of experience where Ukrainian judges and foreign judges are exchanging the experience to mutual advantage. To sum up, dear friends, I would like to thank the participants of our panel, Alina and Alexei. Thank you for sharing your sad experience. Tetiana, thank you for attracting attention to this injustice on the level of media, which provides an opportunity to Ukrainian and the international community to pay attention to this and embark on the way to justice. And also thank you, our lawyers and law enforcers and judges, for helping to establish this justice. I am sure that Ukraine has to not only win the war and to put a fat full stop in this 100-year-old story of opposing the enemy, but we also have to punish the criminals. Thank you, and we are announcing the next panel, which will deal with the next stage of the Russian aggression, which was and is the full-scale invasion.